There's an ancient story from the Winnebago people of Wisconsin and Nebraska that features our hero, literally called Trickster, out on the hunt. He tricks a flock of ducks into dancing, one by one snapping their necks until he's got a delicious ducky feast laid out. But while he's asleep, foxes come and steal them all. So he does what any rational man would do. He takes his own anus off and lays it there as a guard and says, "Anus, shout if the foxes come by." Later on that day, the foxes do come by, but the anus doesn't shout. It farts over and over again. When Trickster wakes up, the food is all gone. He burns his own anus in rage, cuts his own intestines out, and eats both of them. And then he realizes, oh dear. So he stitches himself back together again, but imperfectly. And this is said to be why the human anus is not a perfect round circle, but rather has an indent in the middle. Tales of this rather delightful Winnebago trickster were collected by a guy called Paul Radin, and in 1954, Jung wrote the foreword to his book. And I'm not joking, this is the only time across his collected works that Jung gives a full-length treatment to the trickster. He could have pointed to Reynard the Fox from his beloved Goethe, or even Bugs Bunny. Looney Tunes was at its height whilst Jung was writing, but he didn't. He chose the Winnebago trickster because it's the rawest, least domesticated version of the myth that we still have. And thus, if Jung is right, a representation of something so archaic and primal within the mind of man that just refuses to die. For the trickster archetype is still very much alive in our psyche and culture today. We may laugh at it in Monty Python or spin it into morality tales, but all of those are just domesticated descendants. The real raw core of the trickster archetype is far more destructive. Not for everybody, though, only a certain type of person. Perhaps that's you, or maybe even me. Perhaps not, but we're going to find out. In this video, I'll give you a full exegesis on the trickster archetype, tracking its transformations across history and culture before zooming in on exactly how it manifests in our day-to-day lives. Some of us are perfectly content to laugh at it on screen. That's safe and healthy. But others, we'll get to that. But before we do, if you are as crazy about Jung as me, then check out the Jung Project. That's my weekly private podcast where I go through Jung's works literally line by line. The first 6 episodes are available right now, and I'm in the Discord server every single day taking questions from one of the most amazing communities I've ever seen. The link to join us is down below. Right then, let's take a closer look at the rawest version of these trickster myths. Here are some of his greatest hits. In one story, Trickster coils up his massive penis into a box and sends it across a lake towards the chief's daughter while she's bathing. The entire community tries to pull it loose, but it's stuck. Finally, an old woman pries it free with an awl, and Trickster, humiliated, just slinks away. Here's another one. After chewing a strange root, Trickster begins breaking wind with such violence that he uproots trees and hurls himself through the air. But soon, he can't stop. The dung piles higher and higher until he's forced to climb a tree to escape his own filth. He falls straight into it, splat, and he has to beg the other trees to guide him to water. Highly relatable, of course. And this next one is my personal favourite. Trickster disguises himself as a dead deer, waiting for a hawk to come close. When the hawk shoves its head into his rectum to eat, he clamps down on it with his arse, trapping it. "Aha, Mr. Hawk," he laughs, as the hawk breaks free, featherless and utterly humiliated. On and on these stories go. Trickster cross-dresses, his arms fight each other, he sends his arse off on missions, all the good stuff. And the funny thing is, the Winnebago people didn't censor these stories. They didn't clutch their pearls or think them as some kind of moral evil. They celebrated them and laughed at them and handed them down from generation to generation. What looks to us like mere slapstick, Jung saw as the preserved memory of something much deeper, the archaic unconsciousness of mankind itself. The trickster is the image of a psyche that has hardly left the animal level. It's grotesque, undifferentiated, and unconscious. He's both man and beast, devil and divine. He's both the one playing tricks and the fool himself, all at the same time. These stories clearly aren't a moral allegory either. Most of the trickster stories that you and I would have grown up with typically feature someone who believes themselves to be very wise or very intelligent, getting their comeuppance one way or the other. Think of Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam, or even perhaps more starkly, Wile E. Coyote. There's no trickster figure in Wile E. Coyote. He just brings it on himself with his ever-increasing genius contraptions that always leave him completely ruined. But the raw, real core of these trickster stories isn't that at all. It's a representation of something which is primordial, what human consciousness perhaps once was, long before rationality or anything resembling it arrived on the scene. Strangely enough, Friedrich Nietzsche spoke about something very similar with his concept of the Dionysian, a formless, chaotic potential that was the source of all potential and creativity, but was also extremely dangerous. The thing with the Dionysian, or the trickster, is if we engage with it without proper consciousness, if there wasn't really an ego there that could withstand it, we'd be staring into the face of something truly and utterly monstrous. Not evil in the moral sense, but terrifying because it dissolves all boundaries. Without an ego to engage with these things properly, the trickster would be pure fragmentation. In the Winnebago stories, he literally rips his own body apart, which is clearly a sign that something within the unconscious is being ripped apart. That's what the trickster does. The boundary breaker, the iconoclast, the one who has absolutely no respect for any ideals or values that us as human beings across many thousands of years have built up. And this is the key for the rest of the video. The Winnebago people did not repress these stories. You can imagine if a child produced something like that today, what the reaction of the teachers would be. Oh my God, monstrous, absolutely horrible. No, the thing with repression, obviously, is if we do that, then the unconscious finds ways, sometimes not very pleasant, for that material to resurface again. Jung thought that this was really key. By giving the trickster a platform in these myths and stories and exposing ourselves to them and laughing at them, that seems to keep that force or energy happy. It won't bother us in other ways. But on the flip side, this is why the trickster survives. Because we always, every single day, keep him alive. Now, before we leave the grotesque, I want to show you something a little bit closer to home. This is the famous Bayeux Tapestry, the great embroidery of Norman conquest, 70 meters long, depicting dukes, kings, and battles. It's a solemn work of history, probably stitched together by monks in Canterbury shortly after 1066. You couldn't hope for a greater piece of propaganda and living history, right? It marks the moment when the Anglo-Saxon world ended and the Normans stamped all over it, changing the world forever. But if we look at the margins, the marginalia, you'll find some very weird things. Amongst the animals and mythical beasts stitched into the borders, standard stuff, there are figures that scholars have politely called obscene. Naked men, literally, I'm not joking, naked men squatting, brandishing clubs, or displaying their oversized genitals. What some of us might just call knob blokes. Why are they there? Nobody really knows. Some say that they're warnings against sin. Yeah, right. Others just crude jokes by the embroiderers, although they were monks, bear this in mind. But Jung would have seen it differently, because here we find the same logic as in the Winnebago Trickster tradition. You see oversized genitals. You see something rather profound, or a cultural setup, a hierarchical status, being absolutely undermined with sheer lunacy. It's the same logic. And for some reason, monks of all people, supposed to be the holiest of us all, stitched it in to the Bayeux Tapestry. The knob blokes of Bayeux remind us, no matter how noble the story we try to tell ourselves, the trickster sneaks in at the edges, literally embroidered into the fabric of history. Weirdly enough, this is the key for understanding what the purpose of the trickster archetype really is. Now, apart from the Winnebago Trickster, Jung's favourite was Hermes, the winged messenger of the gods in ancient Greece. He's the god of thieves, travellers, merchants, and messages. He's sly, quick, and witty. On his very first day of life, he steals Apollo's cattle, invents the lyre, and wriggles out of a punishment with sheer silver-tongued audacity. But the difference is, Hermes is not a fool. He's not grotesque, he doesn't talk to his own arse, and he doesn't eat his own intestines. Instead, although being chaotic and although playing tricks on other people, or gods, or animals, he's got more of a promising spirit to him. Rather than chaos for the sake of chaos, he turns it, or metaphorically, transmutes it into poetry, art, and culture. He ignores boundaries, sure, but not to wallow in humiliation. He crosses them to generate new possibilities, to establish connections, and to open up liminal spaces where transformation is possible. This is why Hermes lives on Olympus, but the Winnebago Trickster lives in the dirt. The classicist Carl Carenier, who contributed to Paul Radin's Trickster volume, just like Jung did, described the Winnebago Trickster more as a fool and Hermes more divine. Here's the point that Jung would hammer home. Both of them are images of the same archetype. Their core, that which creates them, let's say, out of the unconscious mind, is identical, the wild, boundary-breaking trickster, but they reflect two very different psychic situations. For the Winnebago, Trickster was chaos, slapstick, and humiliation. But Hermes seems to be as if that same potential, but in a form that consciousness can relate to far more, and perhaps have a more productive relationship with. And in between these two traditions sits the entire timeline or continuum, Jung would say, of ego consciousness. This is why Jung paid special attention to Hermes' later form in Alchemy, Mercurius. Mercurius is the Roman equivalent of Hermes. You can think about them functionally as being exactly the same thing. But in the hands of the medieval alchemists, he became something far weirder. At once the quicksilver metal, the witty god, the dark spirit of matter, the devil's mocker, and also the agent of divine transformation. The weird thing about the alchemists, if we sit back and look at it, they were Christians. But there they were using a Roman/Greek god that they just couldn't get rid of, as if ancient Greece and Rome had long collapsed. But there was Hermes, Mercurius, hanging around and causing them a constant pain. The reason for this, Jung said, is that alchemical opus, the work that they were doing, the transmutation of lead into gold, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, which Jung saw as a projection of the individuation process onto matter itself, it needed an agent that we could relate to, almost as if something that straddled mind and matter, consciousness and unconsciousness, something that us as egos could relate to, the first port of call within your vas hermeticum, within your cauldron where you're doing all of your experiments. The weird thing about this spirit is that it is simultaneously the prima materia, unconsciousness, potential, if you like, that could be turned into actuality, but at the same time was not burned up or changed in that transformation. It was the first thing that the alchemists would come across, or us too, which we'll explore in a moment, when we try and engage with our unconscious mind. It is simultaneously the unconscious and also that part of it which comes to meet us. All of this speaks to the absolute power and essential nature of the trickster archetype. As we said, despite the death of Greek myth and the domination of Christianity, the trickster came back in a relatively untouched form. He returned because the psyche demanded him. You can't just forget about him. He's still alive. Now here's where we've got to tread carefully and be sensitive people. So Jung is not saying that the ancient Greeks or the Romans or the alchemists had a more developed form of consciousness than the Winnebago people. Such a statement would be very rude, first of all, and also a little bit bonkers. That's not how consciousness or genetics or anything of the kind works. But what Jung is saying, through reference to these different myths, is that, let's just say, the ancient Greeks did have a more refined consciousness. They gained more, but also left lots behind. You can actually track this too. This is really fun. And this is Nietzsche's entire game in his The Birth of Tragedy. If we look at the Homeric myths, the Iliad and the Odyssey, you got gods doing crazy things. And the humans, the kings and the princes and the soldiers, they're at the mercy of the gods. They're fun and moving stories. One thing is very clear. Instinct is front and center in those stories. If you fast forward now to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, classical Greece, that's not there anymore. Suddenly people are much more rational. They're more cerebral. They're coming up with things like the theory of forms and hylomorphism and all other kinds of strange, weird and wonderful things. The instinct side of man was left behind. And straddling that transition is Socrates, a trickster figure in his own right, who would walk around pointing out the absurdities of people claiming to know wisdom and claiming to have no wisdom himself. And he changed the world through doing so. This refinement of consciousness is projected into the ever-changing tradition of Hermes. He's no longer a formless, chaotic void, which would be, say, pre-Homeric. He's now suddenly something that we can relate to, something that the unconscious becomes more intelligible through. If we fast forward now to the medieval alchemists, this refinement of consciousness is reflected in Mercurius himself. He's still the trickster, he's still boundary breaking and a cheat, but he's sublimated into wit, mediation, and divine cunning. He becomes a figure that we can speak with, interact with, maybe transform through. None of the alchemists had to deal with ripping their own arse off or speaking to their own fallacies, but they did warn repeatedly against the kind of hubris or inflation that a lot of them would come up against time and time and time again. Imagine you're a medieval alchemist and you believe that you may have at least some of the wisdom of turning lead into gold, the philosopher's stone, the opus. Well, the moment that you think that you've bottled Mercurius, the moment that you turn to that little demon spirit sprite and say, "Give me your secrets of wisdom," Mercurius bites back. He slips through your fingers. He humiliates you to remind you that however high you climb, you are still a stupid animal, just like the rest of us. That is his role. As consciousness has developed, refined, and differentiated across different cultures, so too the trickster has developed alongside us. No longer does it mirror back raw, instinctive, chaotic proto-consciousness. Now it points out our weak spots, our blind spots, and those moments where we feel that we're too clever, too wise, or maybe morally superior to other people. It always has a balancing, regulatory role. As weird as this sounds, you can actually meet Hermes or Mercurius in your psyche right now. And it's something that many people, when they start to engage in more Jungian style personal development or interest, will come up against basically straight away. If you turn to your unconscious, let's say in terms of dream interpretation, and you think to yourself, right, I'm going to use this, I'm going to manipulate this for wisdom, power, insight, or even health, the unconscious will bite back. Dreams will start to contradict themselves. Symbols will begin to mock you. One minute the unconscious will say yes to your ego attitude, whereas the next it might say no, as if leading you up the garden path of your own psyche. You may be sitting there like a proper Jungian and go, well, last night I dreamed of a farting woman. I wonder what the archetypal significance of flatulence is. Whereas the real meaning is that the unconscious is mocking you. And not to be cruel, not because you've somehow failed or you're morally inferior in some capacity, but because pointing something like that out through a joke, through mockery, is exactly what that particular person may well need at this moment in time, to loosen the grip of theory on them, to loosen the seriousness of it. Because only when we're not hyper serious, when we're able to laugh at ourselves and therefore see our own weak spots, only then can real transformation take place. Myths have said this forever. The alchemists said this. Jung said this. And we can see it in ourselves if we take that attitude to the unconscious. This is why so many people burn out on Jungian practices. They treat the psyche like a tool, and the psyche just grins at them and meets them with mischief. So apart from Hermes or Mercurius, how else did the trickster transform across Western culture? Well, if the Winnebago tradition represents that oldest, most primordial, instinctive, animal-like consciousness, and Hermes is that but sublimated into something that us as ego consciousness can transform alongside, then Reynard the Fox sits right in the middle. Reynard is the medieval beast epic par excellence. This cycle of tales stretches back to the 12th century in France, spreading across Europe in countless versions. Think Robin Hood or the Arthurian cycle, that level of popularity. By the late Middle Ages, Reynard was one of the most popular trickster figures in circulation, a cunning predator dressed up as a moral allegory. In 1481, William Caxton published The History of Reynard the Fox from a Dutch version, making Reynard's tales available in English for the first time. Reynard gets up to many escapades, which were billed as instructions for the worldly reader. But rather than learning from noble heroes on their chivalric journeys and courtly love, the person we're learning from is a fox who maims, kills, tortures, and steals. Think Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, but instead of Bugs Bunny just laughing at Daffy, Daffy quite literally gets hung, drawn, and quartered. Here's the story, fresh from the 1481 edition. At King Noble the Lion, that's his name, King Noble, at his Pentecost court, all the animals line up with accusations against poor Reynard. Isegrim, the wolf, says that Reynard blinded his cubs and violated his wife. Chanticleer mourns the slaughter of the hen Coppen, and many other animals accuse him in this kind of way. And Reynard is summoned to face justice. But the trickster never faces justice straight. Bruin the bear, sent to fetch Reynard, is lured into a carpenter's log under the promise of honey, and then he's beaten half to death by the villagers. Tybert the cat, later adapted into Shakespeare weirdly enough, is promised mice in a priest's barn, only to be caught in a snare. In his frenzy, he rips off the priest's testicle before escaping half-blind. And Grimbert, Reynard's nephew, finally persuades him to attend trial, though Reynard just cannot resist lunging at chickens along the way. At court, he's condemned to hang, but at the gallows, he spins a tale of hidden treasure and a conspiracy among his enemies. The king and queen, greedy and fearful, pardon him. Reynard then stages a fake pilgrimage, sending Belin the ram back to court with letters, which turn out to be the severed head of Kuwart the hare. Absolute outrage. Another trial, another performance. But Reynard flatters, deceives, fabricates gifts, turns foes into fools. Finally, he fights Isegrim the wolf in trial by combat. He claws out an eye and, once again, crushes his testicles. And he wins. Declared victor, he is not only pardoned, but installed as chief counsellor. The tale ends with Reynard triumphant, back at his den, and the narrator wryly reminding us it's only a fable, but one full of examples for virtue and warnings against vice. And that's the brilliance of Reynard. He's vile, he's horrible, he loves crushing testicles, but he's no worse than the others. He simply exposes them. All the other characters have some kind of unconsciousness of their own bestial, more instinctive nature. But Reynard owns his, and that's why he's able to win. He becomes a mirror for other people's hypocrisies. And this is probably a style of allegory, a morality play as it used to be called hundreds of years ago, that all of us are very used to seeing growing up. You do see this in cartoons all the time. Or if for some reason you watch the YouTuber Dar Man, well, he's basically the current modern-day descendant of the guys who wrote the Reynard tales. Only with Darman, there's no testicles, only sheer and utter cringe. What we can see with the Reynard tales, though, is a more consciously integrated version of the trickster archetype, the exact same core as with the Winnebago tradition and with Hermes or Mercurius, albeit transmutated into a more Christian culture and context. Suddenly it's about morality with a lot of that kind of good medieval violence thrown in. There was none of the divinity or promise of soul transformation, as say with Mercurius, but instead Reynard would point out in a very biting satire, apparently the favourite satire of our ancestors, all of the hypocrisies and lies. It clearly served a very important function. Now all of this might sound like story and myth, things that we can resonate with, laugh at or enjoy. But the trickster is very much alive in our psyche and culture today. Take this example. Imagine that you work in an office and you've just got a promotion. You're walking around like you're a big office businessman. You have your tie nicely pressed and your trousers fit you perfectly. You're walking around as if you own the place. You sit down at your desk with a mug of coffee. You click into a Zoom meeting and you go, "Hello, gentlemen. Hello, my fellow important people." But you immediately spill coffee at that exact unfortunate moment all over your loins. Was that an accident? Was that your nervous system just spazzing out? Jung would say, no. We can chalk things like this up to being accidents, but watch your thoughts immediately after something like that happens. It's never, what an accident. What a rational scenario. No, it's usually, oh my God, why am I such a loser? Or, do they think I'm such a loser? They must think I'm such a loser. It's always got a kind of homeostatic element to it. That beforehand you're walking around as big office businessman, but now you're reminded that you're a human and a silly human. There's the clue. The accident hasn't humbled us in some kind of trite or patronizing way to remind us to be more good, to be more nice. Nothing of that kind. That would be a projection into the stories. Instead, it's there to remind us that we are not the advanced personas that sometimes we like to identify as having, either being very important or better than some people in certain ways. It's not to do with being fake or inauthentic. It's to do with how we view things on the inside, how we relate to ourselves on the inside. The trickster, in performing accidents like this, is performing a psychic balancing match. There are tons of examples. We can go on and on and on about this all day, but here's some that you very well may have experienced. You start telling someone, maybe someone you want to impress, a story, but then you realize halfway through that you've actually told that story 2 or 3 times to them before, and you get that cringe feeling on the inside. Or maybe you walk on stage or in front of your colleagues to give a speech, some kind of public presentation, but then at the moment your lips open, your voice cracks into a kind of 13-year-old boy. Or maybe you're sitting there and you're trying to impress a girl that you're on a date with. You lean in to sip your rather impressive-looking cocktail, and the straw goes right up your nose. All of these, Jung would have said, are the trickster at work. And the funny thing about these is oftentimes people will say things like, "God, my day is cursed," or "I am cursed," or "I'm bewitched." This is exactly the type of thing that traditional cultures will chalk accidents like that up to, as if something from outside of ourselves has quite literally cursed us. Apart from representing the trickster within comedy and myth and story, this is one of the ways that the trickster is kept alive and manifests all the times. In our slips, accidents, our faux pas. Now, if we strip morality out of the picture entirely, as if you take Reynard and you put him in a non-Christian setting, then the trickster's function really becomes crystal clear. It's not about punishment. It's not about being caught out. It's not about being cursed. It's just about balance. The psyche is always seeking equilibrium and usually based within truth. If you truly are a brilliant person and you believe yourself to be brilliant, the psyche isn't going to punish you for that. But if we walk around with a puffed up persona, an inflated sense of importance, or an inflated sense of morality and somehow being better or more worthy than other people, that's false. That's a false perception of oneself, and the psyche will compensate for that from the inside. This is why we like watching comedy shows on TV. They're always about somebody being a complete and utter idiot and displaying their idiocy for all to see. If we think about Monty Python, often that involves pompous figures being reduced to utter absurdity. Or if we take Edmund Blackadder, he always has a cunning plan, but that always backfires, and he meets his comeuppance. Or if you're in Gen Z, we can take the hysterical absurdity of Filthy Frank, almost theriomorphic in its display, half animal, half human, and absolutely ridiculous. The dignity for the character or the person concerned is obviously completely ruined. But if they can learn to laugh at themselves along with the group, they kind of get redeemed. They're turned into sort of a hero, or at the very least, a relatable person, because all of us can relate to that. And that's what comedy does so well. It lampoons a one-sided consciousness. That's what the trickster's job is supposed to be for. And when we recognize it in comedy shows, we can offload some of that pressure release onto the screen. We can unconsciously or sometimes consciously recognize that what we're really looking at is an aspect of ourselves. We may be intelligent, brilliant, and wise, and moral, and everything else, but we're also bloody stupid. If you recall the distinction between archetype and instinct, if you're not sure on that, by the way, check out episode 1 of the Jung Project for free on this channel. I walk through it in great detail there. Then you'll know that the archetype sits in the unconscious and it watches the outside world. When a scenario, an archetypal scenario arises, it recognizes it and kicks off an instinct. So when we're talking about the trickster, that is an archetype. But what's the instinct? Laughter. The ability to laugh at others, but mostly at ourselves, is a very important instinct within the human psyche. It is quite literally the psyche's pressure release valve. It's obviously involuntary. Sometimes it will come on in the most inappropriate of places. And no matter how serious you want, let's say when you wake up in the morning, I'm going to have a very, very serious day today. By the end of the day, you're probably laughing at some absolute and utter nonsense that's taken place again and again and again and again. And that's a recognition of the folly of the human species. It keeps us human, and it keeps us from inflating or being too one-sided, and therefore keeps us in a state that we can continually relate and transform. Now, the trickster doesn't just live in myth, comedy, or our everyday life. It also lives in projections. People across history and people today love to project the trickster with all kinds of affective flavors onto other people, sometimes with horror, some kind of revulsion away from them, sometimes with a kind of contempt. A classic example, I feel, is Niccolo Machiavelli. Read The Prince straight, and it's really just a survival manual for brutal times. It's pragmatic, sober, and not nearly as diabolical as legend suggests. Yet his own fox and lion imagery didn't really help him not be branded as some kind of evil, hideous, dangerous force that people have wanted to ban or to condemn morally for the longest period of time. Even though Machiavelli is laying out something which is necessary sometimes for survival. He was not a trickster figure, but he represented that enough to draw a projection from other people. Poor Machiavelli. Or if we take Rasputin, the Siberian mystic at the Romanov court, remembered less as a healer, which is what he purported to be, and more as a corrupter, hypnotist, debaucher, and puppet master of the Tsarina. Really, reality was much more complicated for Rasputin. It probably didn't help with the fact that he was poisoned and was able to survive. But again, when you see someone who's almost mercurial in the way that they can adapt, they seem to have almost special powers, but everything that happens around them just degenerates into chaos. That's absolute perfection for the archetype of the trickster to be projected out onto them. And history then immortalizes them. It seems that the culture and the psyche needs the trickster. It's a fundamental category within our brain, within our psyche. And if something appears to closely match it, boom, projection comes straight out. But like with projection, if we see someone and say or believe that they are a trickster figure or they've got an issue or something regarding the trickster, I think we should be more careful, because our own affective reactions to things like this are oftentimes much more telling than someone else doing vaguely trickster-related things. I'm not trying to defend Rasputin or Machiavelli, but I've seen this happen many, many times. It's not particularly productive. So why does any of this matter? Because the trickster is, as Jung spells out crystal clear, the collective shadow. All the inferior traits of humanity summed up and personified. The trickster is stupid, obscene, gluttonous, and selfish, but he is also divine, generative, and in his suffering, close to redemption. And here's the paradox. The shadow survives because we repress it. All the things we don't like about ourselves, no, we don't want to look at those. But the trickster remains because we keep him alive. Carnival, clowning, or comedy, these are not trivial entertainments. They are genuine ways of keeping the trickster in view, laughed at, and contained. When he's forgotten, he erupts in crisis. But when he's remembered, he suddenly becomes much more tame and easier for us to get along with. It's why Mr. Bean is universally beloved. He walks around and makes an absolute tit out of himself so that we don't have to. Great comedians, by laughing at sacred cows, remind us that at core, we're all complete and utter idiots. And by drawing that aspect of our collective shadow out, we can relate to it safely. Thus, at the deepest level, the trickster is civilization itself in embryo. Stupidity turning to sense, chaos into order, meaninglessness into meaning, but never in a linear chain. As the generations go by, we gain more and more knowledge and technology and dominion over nature. But the archaic psyche is always there and always watching. If we go too far, too quickly, it will slap us right back down again. This is why Jung very famously said that the trickster is the precursor to the savior. Only through humiliation, through having our previous ego ideals and one-sided consciousness humiliated and laughed at, can we find the seeds of genuine transformation. Let's circle back to where we began, the trickster eating his own anus and sending his phallus off on diplomatic missions. I presume you've never done anything like that before. But this is the warning, or really the message within myths like that. If we allow ourselves to get too disconnected from the instinctive animal side of life, if we allow our consciousness to implicitly take credit for all kinds of things that really come from outside of us or beyond us, sudden bursts of wisdom and intuitions or our creativity, then we're tipping out of equilibrium and the psyche will laugh us back into it again. What matters is to remain human, a proper personality, flawed, maybe fragile, perhaps sometimes brilliant, but whole. Not Faust in his study, buried in books, despairing over the futility of life, detached entirely from instinct, contemplating death and wondering where meaning has gone. Because that's where the danger lies. In Goethe's Faust, the old scholar grows weary of intellect alone. He's read all the books, mastered all the knowledge, but feels hollow. And in that hollowness, Mephistopheles, the devil as trickster, appears. He offers vitality, excitement, power, the very instincts Faust had cut himself off from. But the bargain is deadly. In grasping for borrowed instinct, Faust loses the chance to be whole, and people die along the way. That is the archetypal warning. When it comes to every day-to-day slip-ups, accidents and faux pas, all of that's funny, and we can laugh at them. But we can't look away or ignore some of the more gritty parts of the Winnebago Trickster cycle, Reynard the Fox, and even the ancient Greek stories too. It's only in modern culture where things have become more sanitized. And some of that's fine for, say, teaching children without scaring the ever-living shit out of them. But at the same time, we lose the more destructive, warning part of the trickster. That's an element. If we push things too far and we keep pushing things too far away from our instinctive nature and towards more rational or moralistic or intellectual pursuits, the trickster shifts from being something that we can laugh at to something that humiliates us to something that will outright destroy us. I don't want to say that to freak you out, perhaps if you're watching this on a Friday night of some kind, but the warning is very clearly there, and it's something that we shouldn't ignore. But the fun thing with this, if we laugh at it, if we realise that at core, we are idiots, we are stupid, we are flawed, none of that is going to happen to us. That kind of destruction really only comes for people who really want to turn themselves either into moral priests or politicians. You see it especially with politicians, how great and wonderful and powerful they are. The overreaches that a lot of them in the Western world, in particular at the moment, are doing is so obscene that you then see time and time and time again, almost as if the universe comes back to slap them with karma. That is the trickster at work. And the more people push away from instinct, or the more people become unconscious of instinct driving them, and the more the trickster is going to slap them. So after all this exploration of myth and culture and history and psychology, the lesson is very simple. Laugh along with the trickster. Let him remind you that you are a human being. Because if we don't, well, you know. If you've made it this far, you are clearly not someone who's into light entertainment, although maybe you are, and you should go and look at light entertainment after a video like this. But you're obviously here because you're deeply interested in Jung. And that's what we're doing with the Jung Project, my weekly private podcast and Discord server, where we read Jung's works line by line. We've done Instinct and the Unconscious and the psychological foundation of the belief in spirits so far. The link's down below if you'd like to join us. And And you'll find straight away that I deliberately inject as much of my own bizarre, absurd English humour into it as possible. And that's one of the reasons why, if we take Jung too seriously, then we're much more likely to inflate with a kind of rationalistic, moralistic nonsense, as quite a few people almost insist that we should do. Instead, no, we should read Jung as Jung wanted to be read. Equal parts logos and eros. And sometimes that means being completely ridiculous. And until next time, whenever you see someone strutting around with moral pomposity, believing themselves to be far better than you should recommend that they go watch an episode of Monty Python. It's quite possibly the best antidote to that kind of arrogance that the psyche has ever invented. Until next time, speak with you again soon.